This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. Our first question today is from Lars from Sweden/US, who says, Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, is of great interest right now following the tragic shootings on Park Avenue in New York late July. What do we know about this condition? Which parts of the brain are mostly affected?
This is a neurological disorder that's becoming very trendy, both because of that tragic event and from lots of other domains. CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Sounds like it's a new disease. It was actually first named about a century ago, where it was called being punch drunk. People who had been professional boxers who eventually became punch drunk, eventually another term for it, boxer's dementia, eventually an even fancier term, dementia pugilistica, but it is now called CTE. So what's it about? Repetitive head injuries, not caused by a single concussive head trauma, but repetitive subthreshold. Used to be, it was only a post-mortem diagnosis. You needed to get the brain. People are working out techniques now for imaging somebody's brain while they're still alive and seeing if there's this neurological disorder. What's it about behaviorally? Long before somebody's brain winds up on a pathologist's table, various components. Most typically, it involves an emerging dementia. It involves behavioral changes, usually in the direction of disinhibition, emotional extremes, in some cases, disinhibited violence. You see individuals very often will wind up with some form of substance abuse because they're trying to self-medicate whatever's going on with them, and the doctor can't tell them what's wrong. And this is a 30-year-old, for example, that this is happening to. And very tragically, very often, along with depression, it culminates in suicide. So what do you see when you slice through the brain of someone who turns out to get a CTE diagnosis? CRUD, a theme we've had, CRUD, protein in the brain that folds up in an abnormal way and aggregates and forms sort of a hairball of abnormal crud there. And this is what you see in CTE. What is this crud stuff made of? A protein called tau, T-A-U, which cruds up and forms things called neurofibrillary tangles. And if you really care about the minutia, it's hyperphosphorylated tau. Wait a second, those of you who still remember episode 26 should be saying, isn't that what you see in Alzheimer's disease? You get hyperphosphorylated tau in the hippocampus and the forebrain, and it forms into aggregates and neurofibrillary tangles, not exactly the same. Nonetheless, it has a lot in common. Just as with Alzheimer's, it is a progressive disorder over time. It causes more and more of this crud stuff to accumulate, but not exactly like Alzheimer's. How come? In a number of ways. First off, when you do molecular biology, the conformation of the abnormally crudded up tau protein is different in CTE than in Alzheimer's. Next thing you see is it's all over the cortex. In Alzheimer's, starts in the hippocampus, moves to the frontal cortex. In the related frontotemporal dementia, it starts in the frontal cortex, moves to the hippocampus. It's all over the cortex in CTE. What you also see through your microscope is something different from Alzheimer's, where this crud stuff is distributed all throughout brain tissue. You see it cuffing around the vasculature, the blood vessels going through the brain. So, cortex, an interesting feature of it. Now, unless you are a manatee and are lissencephalic, you have a cortex that is convoluted. By the time you get to species that have enormous expansion of cortex, they're rippled on the surface. And this is a space-saving trick where the cortex winds up folding in on itself so you can squeeze more of it into the same skull space there. And what you see is in CTE, the damage is to the cortex. Now, initially, this makes lots of sense, and then it makes a little bit less sense. Makes lots of sense. Why the cortex? Why the surface of the brain getting damaged rather than subcortical areas? And you look at what CTE is about, repetitive head injuries. Your head gets bashed over and over. And what happens then is the head gets bashed, the brain jets off in one direction as a result of the COUP, the trauma, mechanical trauma, the coup, and then it bounces back, a counter coup, and it bounces back and smashes back against your skull, which is why you get damage there on the surface, on the cortex there. The one puzzle is when you look at these convolutions in the cortex, you would think the topmost parts up around here, where it's up there, those should be where the damage is happening for reasons I don't fully understand. And I'm not sure if anybody does, but what you wind up seeing is it's at the bottom. It's in the deepest grooves there at the bottom called the sulci of the cortex. That's where it's happening. So why are you getting crud building up and dead neurons and neurofibrillary tangles happening there? And what you got is concussive head injury, this coup counter coup. And at that point, you get mechanical forces of torsional stress on the neurons. And I have no idea what it is I just said, but from the trauma, the vibration, the bouncing around, the spindly parts of neurons, you got the cell body and you got the long spindly axon, and the spindly axon gets knocked around all over the place and it gets severed. And that's where you've got the tau protein running through, forming microtubules, little tubes for transporting stuff up and down. And the axon gets severed, and then the microtubules get all twisted up into these neurofibrillary tangles, and that's what's going on. So, of course, the issue becomes who gets CTE? And most famously at this point, football players. Football players in the years after their professional careers of getting repetitive head injuries. Now, of course, this involves some heroic story involving a person who first sort of brought this to everyone's attention. This was a neuropathologist named Bennett Omalu. And in the early 2000s, he was working in the coroner's office in Pittsburgh. And a brain came in that turned out to be from a retired NFL player and who had just had a catastrophic decline in his function, dementia, disinhibition, bouts of rage, all sorts of abnormalities like this. And this was a guy who was apparently famous, a football player, a hometown hero in Pittsburgh named Mike Webster. I know nothing about sports. I'd never heard of him before, but he was like a football great. So I don't know if he was a really good shortstop or goalie or something, but his brain wound up being examined by Omalu, and superficially, it looked normal. And at that point, your regular neuropathologist in the coroner's office would say, brain looks normal, but here's where the heroism comes in. Omalu gets this. With his own money, he pays for extra slicing of the brain. Who would think neuropathologists have to pay pocket money to get a brain sliced even more so? And looking at it higher magnification, and out comes what is now the recognized profile of CTE, this aggregate of dead neuron, dead glial cells, neurofibrillary tangles, aggregate tau protein crud at the troughs at the bottom of these convolutions in the cortex. And this is where the heroic elements of it take off even more. Because Omalu, lamb in the woods, babe in the woods, whatever he was, he thinks ridiculously, oh, The NFL is going to be so pleased to hear about this, that there's this neurological problem that happens in some of their vets, because by this point, he'd gotten a few other brains from NFL vets who had had the same profile of dementia, behavioral abnormalities, and seeing the CTE stuff again. Oh, the NFL is going to be so pleased so that they could take steps to try to protect their players from this. Oopsie, he turned out to be wrong. The NFL gets together a bunch of neuropathologist toadies and hired guns who quickly announce that Omalu's paper needs to be retracted from its neuropathology journal because it's wrong. It is so tragically wrong. Every aspect of it is wrong. And of course, Umali turns out to be right. And it took the NFL, I think, merely about 7 years to begin to say this might be for real. And then I think it took them another 7 years before they were willing to say that in front of Congress. This is a neurological disease that you see in a lot of ex-football players. And here's where the Omalu heroism is finally appropriately roared. And of course, it becomes a movie I think called Concussion, as well as a movie starring Will Smith, which when you look at Omalu, Will Smith looks nothing like him, but I haven't seen the movie, but I assume the entire film was taken up with Will Smith, either with an expression of consternation, what's with this brain? No one has ever seen a pattern like this before. Or then in the second half, consternation as he discovers that enormously successful, wealthy corporations may turn out not to really care about the well-being of their employees or their ex-employees. And this winds up being what CTE is about. By the way, Omalu is an immigrant from Nigeria. Note that Oval Office. And so this gets put on everyone's platter now as a feature, a frequent feature of NFL veterans who've had a lot of concussive head trauma. People already knew NFL veterans have about 4 times the rate of another neurological disease, ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And it's probably related somehow because as CTE progresses and it gets deeper into the brain, it begins to look a bit like ALS. It begins to have some features of Parkinson's disease. So people finally admit that it's there for real. So at that point, most of the emphasis now switches over to a second group researching this. And this is another major figure in this field, neuropathologist Anne McKee at Boston University, which now has the biggest CTE brain bank out there. And at this point, she has looked at a bunch of brains from NFL veterans. Sufficiently so, this is becoming prevalent enough that all sorts of these veterans are now signing away. When I die, I want my brain given over to this brain bank to be examined to see if what's been going on with me is this CTE stuff. And at this point, there's been at least one NFL veteran who committed suicide, and one assumes with forethought shot himself in the heart rather than the head, leaving a note saying, please have them check out my brain. What's going on with me? And at this point, 99% of the CTE suspect brains from NFL veterans that she and her group have examined turn out to have CTE. Oh my God, mind you, this is not a random bunch of NFL veterans. These are ones who have been having the symptoms of it, and their brains wind up being examined. Now, since then, it's been expanded to other people with a history of repetitive head injuries, professional hockey players in their years afterward. And it's apparently hockey enforcers who I guess are the ones who come and make you move your car if it's parked in the wrong space. But these are like the gangsters of hockey, and they show it. Professional soccer players in their retirement. Other individuals, I had one surprise there because one paper I was looking at said that you see her group has seen a lot of CTE in the brains of ex-pro bowlers. And I said, bowlers, people who bowl, I had no idea that that could involve concussive head trauma until I found out what they meant was football players who had been really great and got into the Pro Bowl, the all-star team. So pro bowlers have high rates of it. Omalu was the first to see it in military veterans with histories of concussive head trauma, not from concussive injury, but from blast trauma, the vibration waves caused by being around explosive blasts. And at this point, CTE has been confirmed post-mortem. And one guy who was a military instructor in how to effectively throw a grenade, instructing generations of soldiers how to do this, and close range of grenade explosions hundreds, thousands of times over his career. Since then, it has also been expanded to be shown in victims of domestic abuse involving repeated head trauma. So the question becomes, how readily does this happen? And this is where a term comes in. There's a dose-response relationship between how many repetitive head injuries and the likelihood of CTE, the severity of the behavioral changes, the severity of the neuropathology afterward, what sort of correlations, what sort of dose response between how many years you played pro football and likelihood, how many concussions you got. For professional soccer players, how many headers you did. You see a relationship between how much of the trauma. And what you begin to see coming out of that is what is in lots of ways the most disturbing thing, which is, there's a lot of football players from the NFL out there, and the NFL is finally doing some sort of monetary compensation for veterans suffering from this. So there's a certain number of NFL players with this, but then a larger number of people who didn't necessarily play in the NFL, but played college football, probably an order of magnitude more than that. And by now, cases of people who only played high school football. What that tells you is each one of these hits in the head is sub-threshold, not enough to cause damage, but cumulatively repetitive, you pass the threshold and this begins to emerge. So this brings out the issue of the shooter in Manhattan a couple of months ago who went to NFL headquarters and attempted to burst into their headquarters and wound up on the wrong floor and shot and killed, I think, a couple of people, and then killed himself. And he believed he had gotten CTE from playing high school football. And he, in some ways, was holding the NFL responsible for having spent years saying there's no such thing. And if there is such a thing, it has nothing to do with football because it's totally safe. And oh, we are so careful about it. And his brain is now being examined to see if indeed he did have CTE, but his behavioral profile before he ran amok fit it.
Next, Carrie from Texas says, I've noticed that you collect examples of great experimental designs. Could you please talk about some of your all-time favorites and any aspects that they have in common?
Oh, I love this question. What a great opportunity. What fun to talk about all-time elegant scientific experiments. All I know about is life sciences. I know nothing about physics, so I'm just going to talk about biological ones. First off, I would have my biologist license taken away if I didn't use as the first example what is universally acclaimed as the most beautiful biology experiment of all time. Everyone uses the same word, the most beautiful, because it was indeed beautiful. And this was the study that demonstrated the semi-conservative replication of DNA. Everybody learns about this one because it was fantastic. This was carried out in 1958. Two scientists, Matthew Meselson and Franklin Stahl, and it's known forever now as the Meselson-Stahl experiment. And they were two scientists. Meselson was a molecular biologist at Harvard. Stahl was at University of Oregon. Meselson is still around. He's 95, and he has spent the latter part of his career protecting us from bioweapon proliferation. So he's a great guy all around. So here's what the issue was. And I'm so excited that we've got all kinds of diagrams here. DNA, double helix. People had just figured this out. People, Watson and Crick, this was the late 50s. This was their breakthrough a few years earlier. And you got a cell, and every now and then it's going to divide into two cells, and thus you got to make new copies of the DNA. You have to replicate your DNA, and nobody knew at that point how it was done. Two models emerged, and the first one seemed most intuitively obvious to people. Well, you had the double helix, and you would sidle up a whole bunch of constructive enzymes that would get building blocks of DNA right next to it, and would look at the double helix and see what was going on and make a new one that was the copy, and that would wind up in the new cell. Messelson and Stahl instead went about showing something very different occurred, which was you got the double helix, and totally bizarre and unexpected at the point of DNA replication, the double helix unwound and the two strands separated. And at that point, the enzymes go into business and put all the building blocks of the next DNA, the strand that fits into this one, building it into there, and the strand that will fit into this one, building it there, and off they go. Note the implications. The old cell has one old strand and one new one. The new cell, one old strand, one new one. How did they show this? They took advantage of the fact that all throughout DNA is nitrogen, and nitrogen comes in a number of different types of isotopes, and I barely remember anything about that. But normally, the nitrogen found in all your molecules, including your DNA, has a molecular weight of 14. They got an isotope that had a weight of 15, and they built a whole bunch of DNA in bacteria where all the nitrogen was nitrogen 15, which would weigh slightly more than DNA made with nitrogen 14. And at that point, now that they've got their nitrogen 15 double helix DNAs, they throw in the building blocks for more copies of DNA, building blocks with nitrogen 14. Now, if the original model was correct, the old ones stay there and the new ones wind up in the new one, you should be able to show the old cell, its DNA weighs a little bit more than this one's. It comes to 15 and that one comes to 14. And what they saw instead was you would make a hybrid new and old, and they both weighed about 14 and a half. So that was amazing. That was beautiful, elegant. How could you more clearly see the answer to that? And this opened up a whole world as people realized, wow, the double helix would unfold and the strands separate. And that's what's going on all the time with all sorts of aspects of regulation. So that's the Messelson-Stahl experiment. And I've now done my duty to my ancestors. Two other experiments that I totally love in very different areas of biology. First one having to do with the fact that fetuses learn stuff. Fetuses have all sorts of brain things happening where they can learn things about the outside world. How was this first shown? Fetuses can learn particular tastes. How do you do this? Here's the elegance. You take pregnant mice and you inject into their amniotic fluid lemon flavoring, totally benign lemon flavoring, or the controls that just get saline instead of lemony saline. And out eventually come all the pups. And what do you see? The pups who had lemon extract in their amniotic fluid prefer the taste of lemon water to regular water. Whereas the control ones, I don't know what this lemon stuff is. It's kind of weird, but they're sticking with the water. They learned to like the taste of lemon while they were fetuses. Note what's implicit in that is slightly creepy that fetuses are drinking amniotic fluid. So the next thing in that field was showing this in humans. Did they inject lemon water into pregnant women's amniotic fluid? No, but something equally elegant. You get volunteers, women volunteers who went through pregnancy either just drinking water and just drinking water while they were nursing, drinking carrot juice while they were pregnant, but not while they were nursing, or drinking water during pregnancy and carrot juice while they were nursing. And what you saw was that babies who were exposed to carrot juice, either as fetuses or while nursing, wound up liking the taste of carrot juice more than babies from moms who just had water throughout. Fetuses learn the taste of carrot juice or learn the taste of stuff and can form preferences. And since then, it's been shown prenatal learning involves learning the accent of your mother, aspects, the cadence of her language, other features of that as well. Totally cool stuff. So that was an elegant demonstration that fetuses learn. Third elegant experiment that I love. This was carried out by a guy named John Vandenberg in 1980. And what he studied was rodent reproductive physiology. You take a cage and you put a bunch of baby mice in there, and they start to grow up and they hit puberty. If you put an adult female in there with them, not the mother, but just an adult female in there, the female pups had delayed onset of puberty. They reached puberty later. Huh. What's that about? This is a competitive strategy. This female is delaying puberty onset of some other female's pups, this evolutionary thing that emerged sociobiologically. But the main thing is females were somehow delaying the onset of puberty of little female pups. And what people began to figure out was the females were releasing pheromones, odorants, which suppressed reproductive maturation in these little females, in these very short baby female mice pups. Moreover, what he began to note was it was only when you had a high population density of the pups in there. And he began to speculate, okay, we are having some kind of population regulatory mechanism here. As population density gets higher, that's terrific. That's terrific in a cage, in a laboratory. Does this work in the outside world? And that's not going to be easy to show because you now want to be able to study different populations of young mice in different locations of equally good habitats, but different population densities. How are you going to do that? And this is where he came up with this wonderful, elegant solution. He went out to a highway to the clover leaves there, and he first confirmed there were no mice in any of the clover leaves. And then he confirmed that if you put mice in the clover leaves, they weren't crossing the road, they were staying in there. And he populated the 4 clover leaves with different densities of mice and put the females in there. And what he showed was past a certain density, that's when female adults began to release pheromones that delayed puberty onset. Totally beautiful, totally elegant. I love that study just because of the clover leaves. How more elegant and sophisticated can you get? What do all of these experiments have in common? They're not very complicated. They're very straightforward. Oh, if the DNA is conserved, this is going to be 15 and this is going to be 14. If it's semi-conserved, they're both going to be 14 and a half. Oh, let's put some lemon juice into the amniotic fluid. Oh, let's just populate the clover leaves there with different densities of mice. So those are these beautifully elegant experiments that I just love. Just to have our maybe becoming weekly news of the world. You might recall from a couple of episodes ago, we were talking about dog ownership and whether that made people more attractive. And I was speculating at some point whether people were giving people fake telephone numbers, and I tossed out the phone number Maryhill 70700. And I wondered if anybody there who was in New York City in the 1960s recognized it, and sadly, nobody did. Murray Hill 7, first off, that was back when the New York Phone Exchange had two letters at the beginning and then five numbers, two letters, MU in this case of Murray Hill 7. Where I was growing up in Brooklyn, it was CL, Cloverdale, first two letters and then five numbers, maybe because people then couldn't memorize seven numbers or keep it in their heads. Remember the Flynn effect of IQ increasing over time. Murray Hill 70700, what was the number? That was for the department store Gimbals and their custom upholstery. And if you listened to the radio in the 1960s, you heard that damn number being repeated at every commercial break because it was ubiquitous. So that's what that phone number was about.
Lastly, Michael from Maryland says, I'm helping an older couple move out of their house, and I'm amazed at the amount of stuff they've accumulated. There's barely room to walk around. Can you comment on the psychology of hoarding? What mindset would lead someone to bury themselves in their own material possessions?
Remarkably, we learned the answer to this a little while ago with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. As brain cells get older, crud begins to misfold and accumulate. And as humans get older, on the average, they begin to accumulate more misfolded crud in all their closets and coffee tables, not universally, but the buildup of junk in one's home with time. At an extreme where you have a pathological accumulation of it, and what is now recognized as a psychiatric disorder of pathological hoarding. So, what's that about? This is not, oh, we have more and more stuff over the years that's just built up. We can't give away this gift. It was such a nice one, and who knows when they're going to come over. This is people whose lives are destroyed by their pathological hoarding. They keep everything. They have decades worth of every newspaper they ever bought. Back when people would buy newspaper on print, they have every magazine. They have every letter. They have every receipt. They have food wrappers from decades ago. They have used toilet paper that they have saved that's piled up to the point that this can actually be life-threatening. For one thing, it presents a fire hazard. When you get hoarding like this and there's kids there, child services eventually get called in because you have mounds and mounds of stuff, potentially life-threatening, because somebody can just get trapped in there underneath all their stuff or buried under it and crushed. People have died amid their hoarded stuff. A scale of pathology that is just breathtaking here. So, psychiatric disorder, incidence, I don't know, maybe 2 to 6% of the population. It's not associated with a particular sex. It's not associated with a particular IQ range. It's not associated with a particular socioeconomic status. What else do you see about it? There seems to be a small degree of heritability, not a huge amount, but it runs a bit in families. There's one gene relevant to serotonin that's kind of been implicated in some, but not all of the studies. Most interestingly is a high degree of comorbidity. About 60% of people with hoarding disorder have some other psychiatric diagnosis. Most commonly, and making sense to everybody, is obsessive compulsive disorder, also linked to histories of major depression, generalized anxiety disorders, social anxiety. So what's going on? And what's recognized now is two profiles of compulsive hoarders. The first one is boring, and that's the one that you see in people as they age, which is they're willing to say, this stuff, I don't need this stuff. I wish we can get rid of this stuff, but it's so exhausting. And you help them out, and they're delighted to do that. The pathological one is the one where the person insists they need all this stuff, because you never know when you're going to need this newspaper from 13 years ago. You never know when you're going to run out of toilet paper and you need to use some used toilet paper. It's an insistence that this stuff is really needed. You need it all the time. You need it somewhere in the future. You need it hypothetically. You can't throw it out because it's important. And what you see is one sort of psychological developmental profile in these people, an identity one. You're more likely to see this in individuals with early life adversity involving loss of some sort of attachment figure, and they get overly attached to objects instead. That's one model that floats around the field. The other one that floats around is one that really taps into people with anxiety, people with a drive towards perfectionism, people with what's called maximizing, optimizing traits, where they have to get 7 different versions of something because it's not clear which one is best. And it is so important to get the best one, the optimal one, the perfectionism there. This is a profile that increases your risks for it. What do you do about it? Cognitive behavioral therapy has some success. People have tried some medications, and it's usually medicating the comorbid anxiety disorder, OCD, depression, that winds up being helpful. One thing that is not helpful, absolutely clear in the literature, which is to go in and forcibly empty out the place. This is wildly traumatic to people like that. And the next morning, they are now working 24/7 to recreate the exact same picture again. That's not the intervention.
And that's episode 80. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.